Ladies and gentlemen, Al Pittampalli.
So the date is March 14th, 2011. President Obama and his war cabinet are meeting at the White House to discuss how to attack the Pakistani compound allegedly housing Osama bin Laden. Now, at first, the discussion is all about coming in from the air. They're talking about firing a small missile from an unmanned drone or dropping a large bomb from a B-2. But there was a few problems, right? The first problem is if you fire a small missile, you might miss. If you drop a large bomb, there'd be high risk of civilian casualties. And in either case, hard to really determine whether you got the guy. That's when the administration, for the very first time, began to discuss the possibility of a special operations ground raid. But in many ways, this was the riskiest strategy of all. What if the raid team was detected while helicoptering into the Pakistani airspace? What if the Pakistani military, which was stationed dangerously close to the compound, engaged the raid team in a firefight? What if US troops were injured or killed? These were frightening questions that required answers. So in order to answer those questions, the president and his team consulted the man who would ultimately be tapped to lead the mission, a man by the name of Admiral William McRaven. Admiral William McRaven is the commander of Joint Special Operations Command. He's one of the most successful military leaders in the history of the United States military. And he certainly looks the part. The guy's 6'1". He's got impeccable posture, this domineering presence, 4-star general. But there was one thing about the guy that was unusual to the administration, something that was atypical of military brass. McRaven was humble. He was modest. He was open to suggestion and unusually willing to change his mind. So from the very beginning, McRaven admitted he didn't have all the answers. In fact, when he first presented his plan to the president, he said, "Mr. President, we haven't thoroughly tested this out yet, and we don't know if we could do it, but when I do, I'll tell you straight up." McRaven ultimately did test the plan. It became successful. But still, he reminded everyone of its fallibility, how things could go wrong at any moment. Now, over the course of many meetings, the president and his team grilled McRaven, questioning his plans, second-guessing his thinking. But McRaven didn't seem to mind. He approached the scrutiny without ego. In fact, in response to a good question, he would say, "You know what? I haven't thought about that, but I need to." And he wasn't just paying lip service. He was making substantial changes to his plans based on the feedback of others. So, for example, McRaven originally proposed having backup Chinook helicopters stationed on the Afghan-Pakistani border. That way they would prevent any infringement on Pakistani sovereignty. But the president disagreed. He wanted those helicopters as close to the compound as possible in case the SEAL team needed to get the hell out of there. McRaven was persuaded. The helicopters would be flown deep into Pakistan near the Abbottabad compound, ready to move. On April 29th, 2011, President Obama, after a careful deliberation process with his team, officially ordered the SEAL Team 6 raid overseen by Admiral William McRaven. Why? Why did he do it? Later, he would explain it was his confidence in McRaven that led him to go ahead with the raid. He said the guy just never seemed surprised by anything. Remember that quote, because it turned out to be true. During the raid, one of the SEAL's Black Hawk helicopters went down. The administration began to panic. They were watching via secure link from the White House. Some people didn't know what to expect next. One person actually thought he might throw up, but not McRaven. McRaven was calm. He was expressionless. Later, afterwards, he described it. He said, "We had a contingency plan. We executed that contingency plan, and we continued on with the mission." And continue on they did, completing one of the most successful military operations in United States history. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Al Pittampalli. I'm the author of a book called Persuadable. And today, what I want to talk to you about is what I believe to be the most critical skill of modern leadership, something I call persuadability. Now, persuadability, or being persuadable, is the genuine willingness to change your mind in the face of evidence. It means rejecting absolute certainty. It means treating your beliefs as temporary and acknowledging no matter how confident you are about any particular belief, you could be wrong. Now, this might be a little bit strange to think about in the context of a leadership skill, right? And if anything, we admire heroes and leaders that do the opposite, that resist persuasion. I mean, just look at the language of successful leadership. Strong leaders stay the course. They defy the odds. They prove their critics wrong. They stand firm in their convictions. And then what do we call leaders who actually do change their mind? We're quick to label them flip-floppers and pushovers. We think of them as weak. In fact, our culture indoctrinates us to believe this to be true, right? I call this the traditional leadership archetype. It's embodied by the 3 C's: conviction, confidence, and consistency. That's what we believe strong leaders to be. That's what I believe strong leaders to be. But for the last 4 years, I've been studying the most successful leaders in history, and modern leaders at least. And what I found is one by one, they are bucking the traditional leadership archetype in favor of a new way of thinking, a new way of leading, what I call persuadability. And the question is why? Why is it that these leaders are sacrificing the cost of being perceived as a weak leader to be persuadable? And the reality is because they know something that other people don't. Being persuadable is the ultimate advantage. So to understand why and understand how, let's revisit the McRaven's raid on the Abbottabad compound. So this one thing you have to understand about the Pakistani raid is it was a special operations mission. And special operations is special. It's unconventional and full of surprises. Information is coming in up until the last minute before the mission commences. And when that occurs, right, in that kind of environment, being decisive, this traditional leadership archetype of the 3 C's doesn't work so well. Maybe it works when the environment is simple, right, when the world is static. But McRaven understood something that most people don't really embrace often, which is that in a world that is more complex, more turbulent, more fast-changing than ever, the answer is to be able to be prepared to change your mind. That's the only way to succeed. In fact, that's the way to be unsurprisable, right? To be the guy that's never surprised by anything, you have to admit you don't have all the answers. And you have to be willing to change your mind. But being willing to change your mind isn't just a lesson for a few elite units in the military. It's happening everywhere. The world is changing. Globalization, hyperconnectedness, the rise of the internet are all making the world complex, turbulent, and entirely uncertain. So whether it be business, politics, medicine, philanthropy, being persuadable, the willingness to change your mind is an advantage everywhere. Because right now, everything is special operations. So the agility, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances is an advantage of being persuadable, but it's not the only advantage of being persuadable. There are actually 2 more, and I'd like to take you through those right now. And then what I'd like to do is actually talk to you about how to be persuadable. So let's talk about the second advantage of being persuadable. On 2007, a man by the name of Ray Dalio traveled to the White House with an ominous warning. The economy was headed towards catastrophe. This wasn't going to be some just regular downturn. This was going to be a deep global recession. Now, the senior economic staffers of the Bush administration ignored Dalio that day. That would turn out to be a huge mistake. Because a year later, the economy went into free fall. The government was blindsided. Ray's competitors were losing their shirts. But Ray was making a fortune. See, Ray was prepared. He had programmed into his trading system some early warning indicators that would tell him when he needed to pull out of certain affected investments. One day, one of his indicators told him to pull out of several banks, including Bear Stearns. A week later, Bear Stearns collapsed. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio is one of the most successful hedge fund investors in the world. Inarguably, he runs the biggest hedge fund in the world, Bridgewater. Some people call him the Da Vinci of investing. And John Cassidy from The New Yorker says he's got an uncanny ability to anticipate economic trends. His competitors are all tearing their shirts out, or tearing their hair out rather, trying to figure out how does he know what's going to happen, right? What does he know that we don't? And that is the wrong question, because he doesn't know, right? He's not Biff Tannen from Back to the Future 2. He doesn't have an almanac that tells him what trades to make. No, the secret to Ray Dalio's success, his accuracy, isn't at all what he knows, it's how he thinks. So in order to explain what I mean, I got to talk to you about this guy, Philip Tetlock. Philip Tetlock is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's an academic juggernaut. He's responsible for what I think is one of the most important studies of the last 30 years. So Philip Tetlock, about 30 years ago, was really frustrated because he wanted to answer this question. Do experts really know what they're talking about? Right? I mean, how many times do you see experts on TV that are pontificating about what's going to happen in the future, right? Do they really know what they're talking about? We never get to know because by the time Judgment Day comes, there's no reckoning because we've all lost track of the predictions and therefore there's no accountability. Well, Tetlock wanted to change that. Tetlock decided to study to track meticulously lots of experts. We're talking about 284 experts in total, upwards of 82,000 predictions, to find out, do these experts really know what they're talking about? After 2 decades, what he found made huge headlines and was pretty depressing. Experts performed abysmally on the whole, right? In general, they didn't perform much better than your average Joe on the street. But there was a silver lining. There was a subset of experts in Tetlock's study that actually performed significantly better than everyone else. And what he found was that it had much less to do with what they know and more to do with how they think. Right? So he classified these successful forecasters and unsuccessful forecasters into 2 kinds of groups. He called them foxes and hedgehogs. So hedgehogs know one big thing. Okay? So these guys had these grand, simple understandings of the world, and they were so confident in these theories that when information would come up or an event that would occur that contradicted their theory, instead of throwing out the information, or instead of throwing out the theory, they would throw out the information. Foxes, on the other hand, had a different way of doing things, right? They had theories too, but they were much more skeptical of these theories. And therefore, when information would come up or an event would occur that contradicted their theories, they would just change their theory. And they would do it over and over and over again. In short, in a word, foxes were persuadable. And now we know the secret of Ray Dalio. He's a fox. And he spends most of his day trying to avoid being a hedgehog, right? In fact, 30 years ago, he decided to start tracking all of his trades, all of his predictions, right? So he took out a notebook and he would write down the trades he was making. And then he would follow up. He would track them and watch them to make sure that those trades came true or were successful. If they weren't, he would assume there was something about his understanding of the world that was wrong, so he would just change it. Dalio's been doing this for 30 years. And he takes no shame in this constant process of revision. Now, from the outside, this makes him look really inconsistent, right? He's constantly contradicting himself. In fact, some might call him a flip-flopper. But who cares? He doesn't, because the reward is deadly accuracy, one that makes him one of the most accurate investors in the world. Let's go to growth now, the third advantage of being persuadable. In 1974, a guy by the name of Alan Ricks, who's a researcher, was following up on a long-term study of kids who were highly disturbed as young boys. He wanted to find out all of these kids had undergone psychiatric treatment, psychotherapy as kids, and he was following up with them to see how they were performing as adults. What he found was that most of the kids weren't doing very well as adults, unfortunately. But there were a few kids that were actually doing extremely well. And what was remarkable to him was when he dug a little deeper, is that those kids, the ones that were doing well, were all treated by the same provider. Ricks came to the conclusion that in the field of psychotherapy, there are a few therapists that are performing exceptionally well, that are getting results head and shoulders above their peers. He called these high-performing therapists super shrinks. Now, at the time, the field was way more interested in finding out what makes for good therapy versus good therapists, and so Ricks's conclusion didn't get much attention. That was until a team of researchers in the 2000s found his study, right? And they were fascinated by it. They wanted to find out what made super shrink so super. This is the lead on the team, a guy by the name of Scott Miller. What these guys had, the International Center for Clinical Excellence, at their disposal was lots of data. So they had a lot of data that on patients, on patient outcomes and therapists. And what they would do is they would come up with a list of attributes, like everything you could think of that might separate the good therapist from the great therapist. We're talking about age, experience, level of education, gender, all of the mode of therapy, all of these things. And one by one, they would cross-check these attributes with the data. But one after one, they kept striking out. They couldn't determine what actually made the super shrink so super. And so actually, after some time, they decided to give up. Until 2 years later, Scott Miller was on a plane. He was on a flight, and he saw this Fortune magazine article, and he picked it up and he started reading it. And it was by a guy, the article was by a guy named Anders K. Ericsson. Now, many of you might be familiar with that name because he's the father of a concept called deliberate practice. So Anders Ericsson's claim to fame is that he studied experts in a wide variety of cognitively complex skills. We're talking about from violin to chess players to lots of different kinds of skills. And what he found was that the quantity of practice didn't determine whether or not these people became masters, right? It was important, right? It just wasn't sufficient. He actually famously came up with this idea of the 10,000 hours rule. So it was important. But what was much more important was the quality of practice, right? Experts and masters don't just perform the same thing over and over and over again. It's not just rote repetition. No, they're constantly concerned with negative feedback. See, what they want to do is they want to understand what are the weaknesses in their performance so they can continually adjust and improve. And they do so obsessively. This was the revelation that Scott Miller needed. Armed with this fresh new perspective, him and his team dove back into the data, and they found something really interesting in their data that they hadn't seen the first time around. In fact, they couldn't believe that they missed it. It turns out when they looked at the lowest performing therapists, they found something very confounding. When you looked at their own self-evaluations, it turns out the lowest performing therapists actually thought they were the best performing therapists. They were delusional. They were suffering from what psychologists call illusory superiority. Don't laugh too hard because we all suffer from illusory superiority. Every single person here thinks they're more attractive, more intelligent, more honest than they probably actually are. And the research has lots of examples of how this works, right? Now, here's the problem with illusory superiority. If Anders K. Ericsson is right, it does protect our ego, right? It prevents us from having a nervous breakdown every now and then, but the cost is it prevents us from engaging in deliberate practice. Because in order to engage in deliberate practice, we need to understand our weaknesses, and illusory superiority makes us not understand our weaknesses. But there is one fascinating conclusion from the research, which is that even though we're really bad at understanding our own weaknesses, it turns out we're actually really good at pointing out somebody else's weaknesses. And so the solution is actually really simple for masters, for people who really want to improve at an accelerated rate. You should allow other people to point out your weaknesses for you. And this, it turns out, was the secret of super shrinks. Super shrinks were obsessive about asking for negative feedback, right? I mean, there's lots of ways to get negative feedback, right? You can try to do it yourself and you can intuit it, which a lot of super shrinks, it turns out, did do. But the main way that they got their feedback is by asking their clients. Now, this is kind of unprecedented in the therapeutic relationship, right? The therapist is usually the one that's giving the feedback to the client. And here they are asking, right? They would ask questions like, how am I doing? You know, how empathetic was I at today's session? Did we talk about what you wanted to talk about today? And they didn't just stop at those questions, right? Like they kept following up because people don't like to give you negative feedback. So they would continue to ask over and over and over again. And they were persistent because they wanted to make sure they got that negative feedback. And that, it turns out, is how they grew at an accelerated rate. And they didn't just ask for the feedback, they acted upon it. They were persuadable. They actually embraced it. They didn't see it as a favor to the other person, they saw it as a gift. Because as Cornell psychologist David Dunning writes, who's one of the foremost researchers on illusory superiority, the road to self-insight runs through other people. So now that we've talked about the advantages of being persuadable, I want to talk a little bit about how to be persuadable. Because it's not that easy, right? Every single person here who buys into this argument, maybe you don't, but if you do, that being persuadable is an advantage, that's not enough. Because it turns out there's lots of obstacles that prevent you from being persuadable, even if you want to be. And we're going to talk about them right now. In fact, it's almost like a quest you have to go on. It's almost like a journey you have to fight. This is our heroine, our persuadable leader who wants to be persuadable. What we're going to find is she is going to experience lots of obstacles along the way that are going to prevent her from being persuadable. The first is this thing called the feeling of knowing. So here's what I want you to do right now. I want you to think about something, everybody here, think about something you're extremely certain about. Something that you're 100% confident about, 100% sure about. Maybe it's a political belief. Maybe it's your belief that either looser or stricter gun regulation would lead to a better society or less crime. Maybe it's a project or a business idea you have in the back of your mind that you're just sure is going to change the world. Or maybe it's an argument you're in with your spouse right now about how to best discipline your kids, and you just know you're right and they're wrong. Okay? Really think about this for a moment. Now, that feeling that you're experiencing right now is what the neurophilosopher Dr. Robert Burden calls the feeling of knowing. Okay? It's a sensation that gives us this feeling of certainty. Now, here's the problem. We want to believe that that feeling is the result of some kind of rational analysis, some good reasons we have to feel that way, and it's not. Okay? The feeling of knowing arises out of involuntary mechanisms in the brain independent of reason, independent of rational analysis. But it sure doesn't feel like that, right? It feels totally reliable. It feels like the truth. But the truth is that it's unreliable. It doesn't always tell us what's accurate. And so here's the problem, that the feeling of knowing is completely involuntary, right? We don't choose it. You didn't choose to have that feeling any more than we choose to fall in love or get angry. These emotions actually happen to us. So we can't just get rid of the feeling of knowing. Right? It stands in the way of us being persuadable, right? Because the first thing we need to do to be persuadable is to accept the possibility that we're wrong, right? But there is a bright side. There is something that we can and must do, because we can't get rid of the feeling, but we can learn to distrust it. And in order to do that, we should recall a moment of opacity. So here's what a moment of opacity is, right? Everyone knows what a moment of clarity is. You've all heard that before. It's like an experience you had in your life where just something was so right that you just felt like you understood the world, right? It was like for the first time ever you could see the universe just completely unobstructed. A moment of opacity is the opposite. It's a time in your life where you were so sure you were going to get something right and you got it wrong. Everybody who predicted that Donald Trump wouldn't make it to a primary, much less win 3 in a row, should have had a moment of opacity. This painful realization that, wow, we don't understand the world as much as we think we do. The problem is, whenever we experience this moment of opacity, 5 seconds later, we forget, right? We learn to distrust that feeling of knowing in that moment because we realize it was wrong, and then 5 seconds later or 5 minutes later, we forget. Persuadable leaders make sure they never forget. Your moment of opacity, as painful as it is your greatest asset because it will remind you to distrust your feeling of knowing. Our second villain on the path to being persuadable is the confirmation bias. So we all know what the confirmation bias is. It's the force that has us believe what we want to believe, right? It gives us information and it causes us to seek out information that confirms what we already know. We've all been led by the confirmation bias. Just think about the last time you've seen an article on Facebook, right? And you see an article headline that just seems infuriating to you, just from the headline. So you click on it and you race through the article as fast as you can, basically dismissing every single point, calling the thing biased propaganda, and then deleting it or getting it out of your Facebook feed, or if you're like me, unfriending the person who posted it, right? This is what we do. This is the protocol. Now, compare that to what we do when we see an article that we initially like. Right? So it's an article, the headline, that seems interesting. I kind of like this. You go through it. It takes you 2 seconds. You read it. You love it. And then you share it with all your friends. And then you celebrate. This asymmetry leads us away from the truth. It leads us to things that we already know, which is great, at least for our ego. But it's terrible when we're seeking the truth. So how do we combat this confirmation bias, which is often insidious? We often don't even know when it's taken hold of us? The answer is to argue with others. So there's this amazing thing that happens. Arguing is actually a beautiful thing. It actually produces often the most reliable results, right? It's the quickest path to the truth. Think about the one area in our society where we desperately want the truth. In our justice system, right? I mean, we desperately don't want an innocent person to go to jail for the rest of their lives for a crime they didn't commit. So what do? We don't commission a team to go on a fact-finding investigation and render a verdict alone. No, we know that the confirmation bias would probably lead them astray. So smartly, what we do is we have an adversarial system. We have a defense and we have a prosecution. We have them argue against each other. Because there's this amazing thing that happens. The confirmation bias alone is a weakness, right? It leads us away from the truth. But when you have two confirmation biases that are directed at each other, that are opposing each other, it actually balances each other out. And so when you argue with people that disagree with you, not with people who agree with you, that can actually result in polarization and make you, get you further from the truth. But when you argue with people that you disagree with, it actually gets you closer to the truth, and that's the best form of being persuadable. But there's a problem, because that's not how most people argue, is it? If you've ever seen an argument, it's more like a quarrel, right? It's like two people are trying to, tear each other apart, right? Just look at the political debates if you want evidence of that, right? So the question is, why is that? So the analogy or the metaphor I use for how we argue is skeet shooting. Right? So you're arguing with somebody else, and somebody makes a good point. It's almost like a clay target is flung in the air that you take your shotgun with, and you shoot it down. And then when they make another point, you turn the gun and you shoot it down. And you obsessively try to shoot down all the points, and if you can do that, then you win. That is a terrible way to argue, it turns out. It's a great way if you want to argue to win. It's a terrible way if you want to argue to improve the accuracy of your beliefs. So why is it? Why do we do that? Well, the answer, one of the reasons, is because of a force called dichotomous thinking. So human beings don't like ambiguity. We like to believe the world is black and white, wrong or right, 100% certain or 0% certain. We want to believe that LeBron James is the best basketball player in the world or he's not. We want to believe that intervening in Syria will produce good outcomes and less conflict in the Middle East, or it won't. And so what the logic goes when you see the world that way is that if somebody can score a point on you, if somebody can prove that one little thing that part of your reasoning is wrong, well, then that means you must be totally wrong. And so therefore, we have to perfectly defend our positions. But that's not how the world works. The world is not black and white. It's entirely uncertain. It's shades of gray. So what we have to do is we have to make uncertain judgments based on probabilities. And so in order to battle dichotomous thinking, we need to think about our beliefs incrementally. We need to update them incrementally. So here's what you do. Next time you argue with somebody and you really want to be persuadable, imagine, instead of putting your hand on your shotgun the entire time, keep your hand on a dial. So imagine there's a dial in front of you. It's a radio dial. And if you turn the dial all the way to the left, that means you're 100% certain in any particular belief, decision, opinion you have right now. All the way to the right means you're 100% certain. All the way to the left means you're 0% certain. Now, when somebody makes a good point, instead of being concerned with shooting it down, all you have to be focused on is just turning the dial. If they make a point that is good but contradicts your opinion, just turn the dial a little bit to the left. If some evidence surfaces that supports your position, turn the dial a little bit to the right. If by the end of the argument your dial is to the left or to the right of where it was when you began, congratulations, you've learned something. You've improved the accuracy of your beliefs. But we can't just turn that dial forever, right? Because at some point, we have to make a decision. We have to take a stand. We have to decide whether to change our mind or not. And that is when the most insidious and most powerful force prevents us from changing our mind, and that is attachment. In our quest to be persuadable, the problem is we fall in love with our beliefs, right? We have what are called favored beliefs, which are beliefs that we care about, that we don't want to see go. It's usually because they're tied into our identity, our relationships, or our material self-interest. Upton Sinclair has a great quote. He said, "It's difficult to make a man understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it," which is exactly the point, right? We have a lot tied into these beliefs, and we don't want to see them go. The people that may experience this, it's most salient for people who experience this is writers, right? So writers are a pretty neurotic bunch. We often fall in love with our work, right? So every sentence, every paragraph can feel like it's our own baby. And so when an editor points out to us that maybe this paragraph isn't the best, maybe this chapter isn't the best, and maybe it should go, we get infuriated, right? Because it feels like we're, abandoning our own offspring. And so there's this indispensable advice that's given to writers, because we know any writer who's worth their salt knows that editing is a critical part of the process, right? We need to get rid of the bad ideas so that we can get the good ideas. And so this indispensable piece of advice that you've probably heard before is kill your darlings. Instead of letting your editor passively and slowly drag your darlings away from you, right, as tears are running down your cheeks, you should grab the knife and take matters into your own hands. Now this sounds, it's a crass expression, right? But for good reason, right? Because it acknowledges the fact that letting go of our favored beliefs can feel painful, can feel wrong, can feel twisted, can feel even unholy. But we have to do it. Because the sooner we can get rid of the bad ideas, the sooner we can have good ideas. But that's not the only reason we should kill our darlings, right? Because so far, what I've talked about is the persuadable advantage for the individual, right? The benefits of agility, accuracy, and growth. But there's a much more important advantage that we should all be concerned with, and that is the collective advantage, the advantage for society. You need to kill your darlings because that often is the fastest path to changing the world. So we, in this society, have this marketplace of ideas. It's a beautiful thing, right? The marketplace of ideas, through this exchange of ideas, actually makes it more likely that the best ideas prevail. The best policies, the best opinions, the best beliefs are the ones that rise to the top. And yet our marketplace of ideas is broken. Because in order to have a marketplace, a functioning marketplace, you need buyers and sellers. But in our marketplace, it's like everybody's a seller, right? Everybody wants to sell their idea, but nobody is willing to buy. And that's a problem. When we think about all the great social movements and social change in history, we think about the persuaders, right? We think about the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Susan B. Anthony, people who changed hearts and minds, these committed activists, that was what sparked and led to change. And of course, those people were fundamental, they were instrumental, they're heroes. But that's not telling the entire story. Because in order for change to occur, in order for people to sell change, you need people who are willing to buy it, right? There were opponents, there were people on the other side that needed to accept and be persuaded in order for that change to occur. So that's my invitation for you all today, is to become buyers. Is to really look into the world and see what are the ideas that I can embrace, that conflict with my current ideas, right? Where can I show up to the table and actually have a genuine willingness to change my mind and to actually accept the possibility that maybe I'm wrong? That's going to require a little bit of a different mindset, right? I say that the mindset that we usually have, the mantra that's going through our head over and over again as we interact with the world is, let my idea prevail. That's the mantra of persuasiveness, but I want to offer you a different mantra today. One that I think is more valuable, and it takes a little bit more courage, but I think it's way more advantageous for society and the individual, and that is, let the best idea prevail. Thank you. So at this time, if you have any questions, there are microphones in the aisles, so please, I'd love to field any comments you have.
Okay, so my question is, how do you ensure that you don't overdo it so you come out as being not have enough credit or not confident enough about your beliefs and decisions and whatever?
That's a really great question. So let's just first dispense with an obvious straw man, which is being persuadable does not mean gullible, right? It doesn't mean always persuaded. So just because you come to the table and you have this genuine willingness to change your mind, if people don't provide you with good reasons or a good argument or a reason to change your mind, then you shouldn't, right? That being said, there's also truth to this idea that we can't be too persuadable, right? I mean, think about it this way. You know, if you're a leader and you're driving and you're about to head off a cliff and there are other people riding with you, you don't have time to be persuadable, right? Everybody's going to have their own opinion on what you should do. But as a leader, when time is short, you need to just steer the wheel. So the opposite of persuadable is decisive. And so what leaders need to do, I think, is vacillate between being persuadable and being decisive. Now, the problem is most people, when they think about leadership, always think that we should be decisive. And if we need to be persuadable, fine, but it's kind of not the hallmark of a great leader. So we'll kind of be persuadable, but then we'll hurry back over to being decisive again. At best, that's how leaders operate. The argument of this book is not that we don't need to be decisive often, because we do. It's that instead of being a decisive leader who has to be persuadable every once in a while, you should be a persuadable leader who sometimes needs to be decisive. So we should live in persuadability because especially when it comes to the big things in life, when it comes to the small things, be decisive, because a good enough decision is good enough, right? You don't need accuracy, agility, and growth. But when it comes to the big things, when it comes to the big decisions, when it comes to important ideas, we need to be persuadable, because that's how we ensure that we have the best outcomes. Thank you.
Yes, so one of the points you mentioned for being persuadable is arguing with others. Now, I find that my peer groups, people who I interact with, they share a lot of the same beliefs. Now, I'm wondering, when I go out there and try to find someone to argue with, am I going out to the street and finding a person that looks with opposite beliefs as me? Or how do I find the ideal person to argue with where it's a positive exchange?
That's a great question. So there's a journalist named Bill Bishop who wrote a book called The Big Sword, and his argument is that our country, especially our country, have kind of turned into this. It's this environment where we are surrounded by people who share our beliefs, right? It's called homophily, I believe, wherein that. Think about where you live, right? I mean, think about New York City, but even your local neighborhoods in New York City. Think about the people around you. The diversity of opinion and political belief is so narrow, right? And so what we need to do, what we need to make sure we do, is we need to get outside of our bubble as much as we can. And there's lots of ways to do this, but one of the ways to do this is through media. Think about the media that you watch all the time, right? There's liberal media and there's conservative media. And if you're liberal, you probably watch liberal news. If you're conservative, you probably watch conservative news. And I mean, the internet is so fractured and fragmented that we could just find whatever is the station or the book or the article or the television show that fits into our existing worldview. And we need to fight that. So what I challenge you to do is, instead of finding books that you already know you're going to like, that you're already going to agree with, find books that you think you're going to disagree with, right? That are completely, different from your worldview, right? It always infuriates me when people give me a book as a recommendation. They say, "Oh, I got you this book. I know you're going to like it." No, give me a book that I'm not going to like, right? Because I always read books that I like. I want you to find the most intelligent, strongest argument that contradicts something that I already believe. Yes?
So I really enjoy your talk, and sort of leading on the last question, I also agree with your discussion of the dangers of the echo chamber that we live in politically and culturally. So I'm wondering if you do see any signs across the country for venues in which people are having these kind of positive debates, an actual marketplace of ideas. The current political debates do not do that at all, and that's within the same parties. So I wonder, where are the places where people with strong different opinions can reliably come together? Do you see any positive signs?
The short answer is no. I think there's a real lack of leadership in that area. I think the political climate is so polarized that even if you try to be that person, if you try to be the person that say, "Hey, wait a minute, let's make sure we're not just gravitating to our ideas or the conservative idea, the liberal idea, let's try to gravitate towards the best idea," that is such a controversial position. So it's very tough right now, which is one of the reasons I wrote this book, because I wanted to try to help shift the culture in some small way. That being said, there's lots of havens outside of the political process, right? So if you Google right now, for example, there's a rationalist community. There's people that pride themselves, they call them rationalists because they pride themselves on being rational and updating their beliefs in the face of evidence that are kind of apolitical in the sense that they don't care from what party the idea comes from, they just want the best idea. And so you can always find those kinds of like-minded people. And I think that what the best thing that anybody can do is to try to take on your own tribe. Because if outsiders decide to be persuadable, that's great. But if you want to change the system, you need insiders to do it. So I actually dedicate an entire chapter to this concept of taking on your own tribe. If you're an outsider and you try to give a speech or try to persuade people on think about the last time a Republican has stood up at the DNC convention and said, hey, you guys need to change the way you're doing this, and that worked, right? That never works. But what happens when a Democrat stands up on the DNC stage and say, hey, we need to rethink this? That often doesn't work either, but it has a better chance. So my invitation to people who want to kind of change the system is to find ways to take on your own tribe. We're kind of indoctrinated to take on other people's tribe. We're always saying, you guys are wrong, our tribe is right. But find ways, the quickest ways to change the world and have an impact is to find areas where your own tribe is wrong.
Excellent talk. So speaking on that subject, I'm imagining the scenario when you're working with your team and you're willing to be persuadable, but obviously other team members are not necessarily, maybe there's some bigger egos in the room. So what are some sort of actionable words or phrases that we could use in the moment to convince somebody in our team to be persuadable? Other than saying something like, well, what if you're wrong?
Okay, that's a really great question. So how do we persuade others to be persuadable, right? The answer to your question is it's virtually impossible in the moment to convince somebody to be persuadable. Because when you say, you're in the middle of an argument with somebody and they're being stubborn, and you say, I want you to be persuadable, what you're telling them is that you're wrong. And that's not being very persuadable yourself, actually, because that means you've kind of foregone the possibility that you might be wrong. And so the only way to actually convince people to be persuadable is before the kind of argument happens, right? Like you instead of kind of advancing any kind of agenda, you actually try to set up an environment in which you all agree to this certain set of rules, right? We're going to let the best idea prevail. So before the meeting occurs, or before you get into some kind of conflict with somebody, or before you start to butt heads, you have to try to spread this idea that the best way to get this accuracy, agility, and growth, and the best way to run an organization, the best way to make decisions is to make sure it's an idea meritocracy, right? We're not picking a decision or an opinion because the kind of the most powerful person in the room says it. We're doing it because it's the best idea. That's a very hard thing to do, again, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote a book. So I would say best answer, give them a copy of my book. Second best answer, do your best to explain it, but not in the middle of a heated conflict. Yes?
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you could expand on what you think or looked at to be the factors that have contributed to maybe what we see as an increase in those number of leaders who are being more vulnerable. And I'm particularly wondering whether you looked at how gender or the leaders' attitudes toward diversity, or to your early point, the amount of diversity surrounding them, either helped or hindered their ability to be persuadable.
Yeah, so I think that the rapid pace of change is really what has allowed these leaders to actually be more persuadable more recently, right? Like we're seeing a rise, I think, of persuadability. Now people have always been persuadable. I mean, I talk about Abraham Lincoln in my book and how I thought he was an extremely persuadable leader. So this is not a new phenomenon. But the reality is, in a world that's so complex and so hyper-competitive, we need to be willing to adapt and to change very quickly. And if you think about it, it's just a logical conclusion, right? The way that you adapt and change quickly, you need to make all new change is preceded by a new decision. All new decisions are preceded by a new belief, right? A change in mind. So the quicker you can change your mind, the quicker you can adapt to changing circumstances. As for gender, I don't comment a lot on gender, at least right now, because the research is a little bit mixed, and it's tempting, and there is some research to support that. For example, women have a tendency to be more open-minded and more persuadable than men, although I haven't really confirmed them, so I don't talk about that that much. But I think one part of the research that seems pretty unequivocal is that diversity, whether it be ethnic diversity, gender diversity, really does help. Because like we talked about, one of the ingredients for being persuadable is to get different perspectives, different opinion, to argue and to exchange ideas with people that disagree with you. And people, diversity, that's what diversity is, right? It's people who come from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different cultures, who are trading ideas, who have their own kind of prism through which they see the world. And so to me, it seems completely logical that diversity would lead to better arguments, to better exchanges, and therefore better outcomes.
We all have our beliefs, and we basically do things based on our beliefs. What do you think about the idea of actually doing something against our beliefs as an experiment?
That's a brilliant idea, and I kind of advocate that all the time. It's amazing how the number of times, the small number of times we ever do stuff that is contrary to our beliefs or our intuition. I mean, what's amazing is, like the cultural meme is trust your gut, right? Like that's the big thing. Everybody's trying to encourage you to trust your gut. We always trust our gut. There's nothing remarkable about trusting your gut. We trust our gut all the time. You trusted your gut a million times today, every single interaction. It's actually way more interesting and way more difficult to actually distrust your gut, to actually make decisions and to do things that are contrary to your beliefs and your pre-existing attitudes. So one of the things you have to be comfortable with, and that's what this the first step to being persuadable that I talked about today, is to recall your moment of opacity, right? The whole point of that is to get you to remember that this feeling that you experience that is produced by your beliefs is not the truth. It feels like that's the right direction, right? It feels like it's the right thing to do, right? Like the writing example I think is salient here, right? Like when somebody criticizes your work, whether it be in writing or entrepreneurship or anything, your gut, your belief tells you that they're wrong. And it's the hallmark of responsible adults and intelligent people to say, wait a minute, I'm not objective on this. Maybe it's possible that I'm wrong. And it's just that space, it's that distance for a second, that recalling your moment of opacity, that separates yourself from the thought, from your belief, from your intuition, that allows you to make a rational decision. It's what Daniel Kahneman refers to as system 2 thinking, that we all need to become much better at.
You had this idea to write the book, and you had the insight, and then you wrote the book. How were you persuaded when you were writing it? How did your mind change? And how did you change your original theory?
That's a really great question. I've had to toss several chapters of my book. In fact, this book is 65,000 words. I probably wrote like 600,000 words in total. And because I really tried to eat my own cooking here, which is really tough, because I'll tell you what, Persuadable is like this easy thing when you're intellectually talking about it, but when you have to do it yourself, you're like, well, this is not easy. Because what would happen was I would read somebody's research and I would say, wow, this is fascinating, this fits right in with my argument, and then I would call them up for validation, and you could see yourself starting to lead them in the direction you want them to. And they're resisting, and then you're asking these loaded questions to get them to say what you want them to say, and it's a real... it takes a lot of kind of effort and courage to say, was I leading them too much? Am I wrong about this? And, luckily, I think I had some good editors that helped me with this, but I wasn't perfectly successful, and that's the lesson of being persuadable. Human beings are very flawed this way. Our confirmation bias is extremely strong. So I did my best, and I think I did probably better than most, but I wouldn't say that I'm perfect by any measure, but I think the lesson here is for all of us, which is, what is your contribution to being persuadable, right? Where in your life, where in your work, where in your business can you take the time to address the confirmation bias, really confront the possibility that you may be wrong, and then follow the evidence wherever it may lead. I think it's the best thing for you, and I also think it's the best thing for society. So I hope you'll take this message and really embrace it and act upon it. Thank you so much for coming today. It was a real pleasure to speak with you.